All right, welcome everybody to another episode of No Easy Answers, a podcast about politics, philosophy, and the human condition. I am here with an esteemed colleague and friend, Rob Larson. He is a professor of economics, and he's written a number of books. He's written Capitalism versus Freedom, The Toll Road to Serfdom. He's written Bleakonomics, a heartwarming introduction to financial catastrophe, the jobs crisis, and environmental destruction, and Bit Tyrants, the political economy of Silicon Valley. Today's topic is Friedrich von Hayek and his thoughts and, specifically his work, The Road to Serfdom. And Rob was, gracious enough to join me and hang out and talk about this. I think you actually wrote a book, didn't you? Like kind of like as a rebuttal to all these separate arguments. Is that correct?
Yeah, Jules. Yeah, thanks for having me, man. Yeah, totally. That's what the second book was. Yeah, Capitalism versus Freedom, The Toll Road to Serfdom. Yes, it's just a reality that's, I'm sure as many of your listeners know, even if you're, a very young person studying society and philosophy and so on, somebody will recommend either Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom to you, or especially if they're a little more intellectual, they'll recommend Fred Hayek's book, yes, Road to Serfdom, about how, European welfare states were going to lead everyone back to indentured land servitude. One still waits.
Yeah, man. So, the thing about The Road to Serfdom is that it's funny. I knew this dude in upstate New York who was very well-read, seemingly kind of a Marxist guy. But whenever you started to talk to him about markets, he would quickly bring up some of the things about markets that were not possible for mere mortals. Mere mortals, it seems like, to understand. Like, markets were vast and they were unknowable ultimately, and they informed us about certain prices and things like that. And so I never really knew what kind of shtick this guy was on, and then I started researching someone named Fred Meyer, who was like an apparatchik for the Communist Party. And he read The Road to Serfdom when it was published in 1944, I think. And from there, the guy went on to renounce his communist ideology. And he ended up writing columns for Bill Buckley, So I guess what I'm getting at, the question is in terms of, what is it about The Road to Serfdom? Like, are these arguments persuasive? Is it the way, Hayek writes? Is it just a good argument to be made against a planned economy? Like, what is so convincing about Hayek, or is he not convincing at all, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a great question, man. And there's something to be answered there, because it definitely does have an aura about it among people on the right, especially more intellectually persons on the right. But, Rush Limbaugh always recommends, Friedrich Hayek and so on. So it's a broad thing, but definitely more than other writers on the right, like Friedman, who I think people see as too mainstream or pedestrian, and Rothbard, who's more inside baseball and kind of more specifically Austrian and stuff. Like Friedrich Hayek, like, I think, any political area where people are into their politics, people want to have a couple of core books. Everyone wants to have a Quran that they can, refer back to and so on, whether they see it that way or not. Like, the need for foundational text is real, especially just to give to your mouthy relative who doesn't agree with all of your right-wing premises. You give them a book and they're like, this will teach you. I don't think it's the writing itself. I mean, obviously we're looking at a translated text, of course, and Hayek's writing in English are not bad or anything, but I don't think there's anything special about it. And the book itself, I mean, it is clearly written for more of a European context, because we have all this social democracy. It's going to stop us. And I always think, like, the United States, we never even got near that point. Like, what? We don't have we don't have worker seats on boards. We don't have anything like the European safety net or the variety of services, even merely health insurance itself, of course. So again, as all things with the right, it does have a tendency of, like, we are just the alliance fighting the empire of social democracy. And it's the United States, where it's like we can't expand Medicaid in states for poor people health insurance. Like, so it does have that weird sort of feature to it. I think it's just become a book that is like seen to be good on these subjects, even though, it is sort of European-y and there's nothing really special about the text. But I think the main reason why, I would say, if there is like a reason that originates in the body of the text itself and not just the right-wing need to be like, some principles here are these shitty mid-century books, that'll do. I think if there is a real rationale for it, it relates to Hayek talks about information and sort of what you were referring to your interlocutor saying about how markets are like bigger than people, like they're huge institutions and they communicate some things to us. So I just noticed that Hayek, and maybe someone can correct me on this, but I think he's most associated with or seen to have pioneered a lot of the modern view of like a lot of market mysticism we have today, where markets are these amazing things and we're just trying to understand them. He always claimed that people didn't invent markets, which I thought was like a wild. Like markets are like numbers. Like, did we discover them or did we invent them? That's like a thing philosophers debate. He saw that as like markets where you go shop, which is getting a little grandiose, I feel.
So like in terms of like a foundational text, I mean, this seems like there's a lot of shit a lot of bullshit on the right that we can trace back to Hayek in this text. And so I think it's important that we sort of look at this text and examine it, as you mentioned, as you described it, as a foundational text. And if it is indeed foundational, I wonder if Hayek, if you could maybe speak to, like, I've noticed that Americans have a very sort of negative connotation of freedom. It's more freedom from than freedom to. So like freedom from government tyranny, freedom from Big Brother, small government, this libertarian small government, Robert Nozick sort of liberty over equality sort of thing, right? But I wonder if this foundational text of Hayek has anything to contribute towards, I guess, what I've termed like a negative connotation of freedom. Like, does Hayek contribute towards this sort of negation of freedom that's seen as somehow positive?
Indeed, he definitely does draw the same distinction in this book itself. As I remember it, it's been a few years since I read it for my own book length rebutting. He doesn't rely so much on that specific terminology, but it's the same ideas about how, what liberty is, yes, is, as you said, negative freedom from, as they sometimes say. So if there's limits on government authority, if they can't just conscript you or tax you, like they have to pass taxes with elected representatives. So this reduces the power of the state over you, or you have like some civil liberties that are circumscribed and protected on that basis. We say, okay, you have freedom of speech. The government can't do prior restraint on what you say, and so we see that as constraining the power of the state and increasing the domain of individual freedom. Pretty sensibly, I think. We can all see the logic of that, and that's what all those French Revolution like bourgeois revolutions are often about: is allowing a rising, wealthy merchant or industrial class to enjoy all those freedoms from government overweening or taking away their assets or regulating all the fun they can have. But of course, positive freedom or positive liberty talks about your freedom to do different things. And if the society has a rich availability of some asset, are you free to consume some of it or not? So once you have a big developed economy, this means more. If it's a feudal or post-apocalyptic landscape, we can't produce anything. What does it mean to have a right to something that doesn't exist or that no one has? If you're a peasant in 800s Europe, it's true. You don't have a positive freedom for like a bridge for your falling out teeth for dental care, but it doesn't exist, But once you have big developed economies, post-industrial revolution, we always say that it doesn't eliminate scarcity of goods, but it does attenuate it because we can mass produce and reach scale economies that lead to monopoly, but also mean we can have a standard of living if we feel like sharing any of those gains with people who aren't the capitalist investors who own the firm, of course. But so with Hayek, it is interesting because he says, yes, we have these traditional freedoms that are the legacy of the bourgeois revolutions. I mean, he wouldn't use that term. But, he said this is what made Europe great, is because, we had this gives the freedom to the great capitalists who, of course, built up our society and gave us all our freedoms and gave us all of our jobs, leaving out the extensive preparatory work by states and endowing growing industries like rail and steel with subsidy, and today with technology and chip making with big state subsidies and so on. That's just helping the market. That doesn't mess with our claims at all. There's a lot of interesting details there, but it is definitely broadly how he sees it. If you read like Friedman or Rothbard, you'll get more that's in the specific terminology of positive versus negative freedom and liberties. But of course, the big argument usually is, like Hayek saying there, is positive freedom. That's not That's not real. That's a false claim that you have a right to something. No one has a right to anything. That enslaves other people if we decide that someone has a right to something. Even though firemen seem very free, and we all have a right to have our buildings and person put out when we burst into flames. So again, that's the serfdom that we're in, is that someone will be paid to provide a universal service, which is now slavery, I've decided. But it's the same framework. It's that capitalism is supposed to give us positive, we have a negative freedom, and it doesn't give us positive freedom, capitalism. You don't have a right to anything if you can't pay for it. What my book argued, of course, several years ago is that that's a half right. We all agree capitalism doesn't provide any positive freedom. I say it doesn't really provide any negative freedom unless you're wealthy. Like it does, but of course, like everything else, it's rationed by money in the United States and capitalism, So really, we're not getting either of those valuable freedoms that we should have, those of us who aren't the wealthy class.
Right. Yeah, I would love to get into more of your book, the capitalism versus freedom, definitely, because I definitely want to hear a lot of the arguments that that you made in response to these. But before we quite get there, I'm wondering if we can speak to the sort of period of when this book was released in 44 and what that sort of political climate was like at the time. Because as I started to do some research for this stuff, and a thought occurred to me that perhaps 1944 might have been the perfect and most optimal time to sort of drop this road to serfdom bomb, considering that we had just came through the 30s and the sort of anti-Stalinist turn that had happened during the 30s. And, we had I guess the Red Army hadn't quite marched all the way to Berlin yet at that point, too. So would you say that's kind of, is there something there in terms of its period, when it dropped, or perhaps could you speak to this time period and maybe the road to serfdom would not have been as convincing, or if it was 10 years in either direction, I wonder what that might have been like.
Yeah, well, for sure. Yeah. So 44, towards the end of the war, it was clear that fascism would lose broadly, especially later in that year. So people are looking around the corner. And it was a time, even in the United States and certainly in Western Europe, of just cresting demands for social democracy, if not more, actual revolutionary changes, all reasonable, I would say. And of course, yes, this is a time when the Red Army had managed to, survive just the endless hammer blows of fascism and do most of the fighting and dying to defeat the Nazis and so on. So there's that moral credibility in addition to just the straight moral arguments of socialism. All of this has been erased from, contemporary discourse, but some of the big figures from this time, from George Orwell to Gandhi, are huge critics of capitalism and deride the idea that freedom originates in the marketplace, and have all these fun, post-colonialist or socialist ideas about what we can do about them. So it's a time when there was just cresting popular demand for at least social democracy, much to the horror of Hayek and his other, wealthy friends and correspondents, including also, Ludwig von Mises of the, proud noble Austrian family, and then, founder of a school of, from a financial, dynasty as well, and is founder of a school of thought that says you should never take any assets from little tyrants who have them and use them to support Mussolini and so on. So you could see how he was writing, he definitely wrote the book for that time. If you're a reactionary and, the reactionaries are losing World War II, who your family may or may not have backed, sort of, which is bad enough, then also every part of the victory is being interpreted as this huge mandate for social democracy. And it's just, how far is it going to go? Like Churchill, is Labour going to call for nationalizing rail and electricity? Just the fear of that. So it's definitely written at the right moment, I would say, and kept its legacy, though, especially in Western Europe, where despite it all, despite years of austerity, social democracy has sort of endured, especially the most popular programs. Even here in the US, it's still an issue that the right is constantly sniffing around privatizing Social Security and Medicare, or, creating new tiers for us when we retire so the boomers will be secure. So that market is enduring, that's looking for an intellectual that you can give to your bookish nephew who's flirting with the left or has a Bernie Sanders t-shirt. You can give him this book, and markets are so great, and it's greater than man's own works, and especially as you and I have talked about briefly before, like Hayek is most associated, especially in this whole market mysticism, with how markets treat information and, the issue of prices and stuff. So we can get into that specifically too. But like all of that made Hayek just like such a impeccable intellectual figure for that moment. But he was, of course, himself as an individual, part of the whole right wing current, the counter revolution of this era. And of course, it's a founding, Mount Perlin figure. And as I recall, I talk about this in my book. I mean, this is from memory. It's been a little while. But he was one of the figures, involved in that who we have correspondence from, I believe it was Hayek, saying we cannot, maybe it was Rothbard or something, we cannot have like the industrialists and legacy millionaires of Europe crushed as they were under 1950s European progressive taxation and the destruction of a lot of their capital in the war itself. He made the point that we don't want any of you wealthy right-wing interests, you post-fascists who are funding this. We don't want that to be part of the face of it at all. And they were very conscious at that time of being seen as just some dissident intellectuals bravely dissenting against the social democratic or even socialist consensus among intellectuals at that time, and not wanting to be seen as just a rearguard front by the reactionaries whose right-wing horses had lost under the guns of the Soviet Union just over that period.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So, it's funny, man. I was in some of my research for this. I guess I had a thought that, I mean, clearly this is a work that is arguing against a planned economy by way of sort of beautifying and making arguments for a sort of free market economy. And I sort of thought that the argument could be sort of reduced down, whereas a planned economy is based on needs and a market economy is based on demand. And I wonder, just in terms of just, being a professor of economics yourself, like, could you speak to the sort of, I guess, does that accurately kind of describe the crux here? Like, are we dealing with two different architectures and one is like completely off the mark as far as human needs, it deals with human desire, versus the other one that deals with like the material needs versus luxuries? I mean, I don't know if that's a distinction to be made there, but is that kind of a reducibility or a sort of a theme that you would say kind of essentializes sort of the crux of Hayek, what he's arguing against, what he's arguing for, et cetera?
Yeah, for sure. Indeed. And, the sleight of hand is always between, what we economists call demand and effective demand, because their whole discussion, and Friedman, I remember talking about this specifically more than Hayek, although it's all very implied in Hayek's discussion of the sovereignty of consumers and, how markets arrive at that efficiency. It's sort of based on that key idea. The demand, when people spend money to express what they want to buy, is equivalent to the needs everyone has. And exactly, with a planned economy, you're thinking about the needs as best as we can project what they are. And actually, often planning means taking seriously the needs of people who wouldn't be able to express those needs in the form of market demand. In economic theory, we talk about just demand as, the things that people want, but it's only effective demand when it's backed up with money. So although starving people in the third world might demand food, they could demand food all day. That's, and they do. But it's not effective demand until they have actual money that makes their lives and their demand for food actually worth something. And so their kids can have food because they have money. So it's pretty gross, but it does, of course, mean that, in reality, what we talk about, it's the sovereignty of the consumer. It's the sovereignty of consumer graded by wealth. And if you're the bottom 50% of humanity in the United States, around the world, or in history, you have zero wealth, and the market will not reflect your demands. Usually what you'll see is something that's provided to keep the masses from causing trouble. Like, here's cheap entertainment or cheap beer, or, the Coliseum, or, cable TV or whatever. As you move up the income scale, income and wealth scale. All right, well, now this demand is more and more relevant. And so we'll have industries that are willing to supply it and so on, because you have a working class or a middle class job that provides some wealth. But it does mean that it is true. Like, the economy spends significantly more work, devotes more economic resources to ludicrous luxuries that are demanded by the mind-bendingly wealthy bastards at the very top of the system after 50 years of neoliberal wealth concentration. And so as part of the research I'm doing now, now. It's the book I'm working on over the last few years on the ruling class. I mean, it's as simple as just pulling up YouTube, which your listeners can do later, and just searching for you can easily go online, thanks to the abundance of information, and watch tours of yachts that cost like several tens of millions, like luxury, like the high-end luxury yachts. It's just completely baffling the incomprehensible amount of resources poured into this, but it's satisfying effective demand of these godforsaken, wretched, inbred billionaires who have nothing to do with the stupendous amounts of money that they have, except spend them on dick measuring contests where it's, well, I've got a bigger yacht than this Silicon Valley guy. Oh, a Saudi's got a bigger yacht than me. Damn. For like the most ludicrous wealth wasting displays, much as biologists talk about how peacocks and organisms that do like big elaborate mating dances, it's all just to prove health in a sexual selection setting there. The same is true here, only like much more boringly, and rather than fancy feathers, it's taking the income of 5,000 nurses and turning it into a really fancy boat you can take your senator friends on. But it does mean that like market signals are just like ludicrous because they're for 10 reasons, which we should keep talking about, because this is sort of Hayek's signature issues, markets and information. Like it's all like the information is loud if it's coming from wealthy market segments. And if it's from a poor market segment, it's still be so weak that you cannot even hear it. So much about this whole discussion of prices as being this immaculate machinery for giving us, an automatic balancing of the economy, as Hayek would say, or giving us, a market clearing condition, as Friedman would have said. It's all premised on sort of putting to the side, well, yes, the distribution of wealth does mean that most of you will be disenfranchised from this form of the market. But of course, that's their whole political goal anyways, to restore that original condition in the first place. So it's a fitting accommodation for them.
Right. So I wonder, could you maybe lay out what the core arguments in The Road to Serfdom are, and if Hayek is sort of reaching for authors, is he just expanding on Adam Smith's Invisible Hand, or is he reaching for David Ricardo or something? Because I'm interested in how so certainly Hayek had to gather some ideas before he wrote this book, right? And a lot of his ideas just seem tied to they're just exacerbated ideas that we've seen before. So maybe just the core ideas of what his argument is, and where those ideas have their origin.
Oh, sure. Again, it's been a few years since I did my last full pass.
Yeah, no worries.
Serfdom. But the large main argument is just to the extent that when you have what he would have called a liberal economy in those days, many libertarians to this day will say that they are classical liberals, which, as we'll see, is a pretty grossly inaccurate way to refer to the classical economists like Smith and Ricardo, especially. So we would call that liberalism, and just meaning the system that we developed after things like the French Revolution and the American Revolution here. It's a system of limited government where there's representation based on some kind of franchise, and the state has very specific delineated duties, and it can't take on new ones unless there's a big approval process. And it means that most of the economic activity in these societies will be conducted privately. And this is the liberal approach, the state is leaving the rest of us free, liberalized to conduct our economic activity and satisfy our needs through entrepreneurialism rather than through some sort of public provision, which would require planning. And sort of the center of the book, intellectually, and as well as Hayek's succeeding work, which we can talk about, is looking at how markets decide how much to produce and bringing us harmoniously in balance without a coercive authority like some external planner in a state. And, there's a number of chapters describing this and why. And of course, the big attribution, the big additional claim is that this is the source of prosperity. It's not just that we'll have more, liberty, as he would have said, or, negative freedom, as we might say today, but also that this is, all of Europe's prosperity is from this. And this is why we have great commercial centers that we're all so proud of, and the source of all of our wealth. Again, coming from a family like he did, he was someone who got to experience some of that wealth. So naturally, he supported that system. And again, as with all these conservatives, very little discussion in these texts about how much of the wealth that we're taking for granted and, thoughtfully investing and multiplying once it's in Europe, how much of that wealth is coming from various large continents elsewhere on the planet that are just utterly being exploited, at the end of a big, fat, coercive state gun by, name the seagoing European state. Pretty ugly, conventional right-wing argumentation there. But that's sort of the core of the argument there, is that with this classic liberalism, We have the plenty that we have, and also the real freedom. And sort of the other additional argument is all this push for social democracy, like this will cause us tyranny. And he does, he's more, he's a European writer, so he's contending with the stronger social democratic impetus than, say, Friedman and other U.S. writers are. So he's more willing to say, like, well, perhaps we could accept this. Maybe health is important, or the environment. Yes, we need government protection there. Much further than other right-wing comparable writers in the U.S. were willing to go. But he's dealing with European audiences there, and there, if you don't at least accept post-war Europe, if you don't at least recognize the overwhelming public demand for at least public health, insurance and care, you just become irrelevant to everyone. So Hayek kind of breaks his principles in certain parts and says, well, yes, these may be public goods. Perhaps that is a real thing, public goods that benefit people, outside of market transactions and so on. So he's willing to allow for that. But as far as the relationship to the classical economists, like Adam Smith or Ricardo, it's interesting because, today's conservative economists have a pretty troubled relationship with the classical economists. They're able to manage it just fine because, like all right-wing thought, it's incredibly superficial and weak. And even where it's systematic, it's all based on lazy misrepresentations and unreadings of opposing views. And it's just weak sauce ideology front to back. I mean, so often, I've read and written a ton of reviews material of right-wingers. I have a book-length rebuttal of Hayek and Friedman, for God's sake. Yeah. And a lot of my left-wing buddies like Ben Burgess or Nathan Robinson or Matt McManus, some of us are like real. A lot of what we do is reading right-wing shit. I'm reading a new Tuttle Twins right-wing children's propaganda book for current affairs right now, for example. Sure. So I've seen you read a lot of it. You do learn like there are levels of shittiness and how shallow it is. I don't want to just say it's all cosmetic and weak, but it broadly is the case that is true. So if you look at these guys, the way they connect up to the classicals is to say, well, Smith said that there's dynamism in the private sector, and that's where economic growth will come from. Mostly it's about forgetting their arguments. I mean, Smith's main argument was if you have conditions of perfect liberty, you'll come out with perfect equality. And if we don't, then we don't have perfect liberty, which is an amazing thing for people not to. It's an amazing thing for people to say that Smith would be content today when we have more inequality than arguably ever, even in the Gilded Age, Yeah, man. But guys like Smith and Ricardo, though, they're classical political economists. And so they have a lot of theoretical weaknesses, like the main one being that they're able to recognize the existence of market power. And so, like the first, I like a lot of quotes and epigraphs in my books. Little short quotes at the beginning of a chapter to give you an idea what it will be about. Right. And readers love those, and it gives you a taste of where you're going. And it's fun to pick out something and think about how it's profound and represents something important. And so, a couple of mine in here, are from Adam Smith. This is the very, very front of the first chapter here. I'll just read a short little paragraph. Sure. Are you sitting comfortably? Adam Smith, who's the first word out of every Republican's mouth, right? Masters, referring to employers and masters of like firms in those days, you'd say masters rather than bosses. Masters are always and everywhere in a sort of tacit but constant and uniform combination not to raise the wages of labor. Such combinations, however, are frequently resisted by a contrary defensive combination of the workmen. It is not, however, difficult to foresee which of the two parties must, upon all ordinary occasions, have the advantage in the dispute and force the others into a compliance with their terms. The masters, being fewer in number, can combine much more easily, and the law, besides, authorizes or at least does not prohibit their combinations while it prohibits those of the workmen. And there's a lot of additional discussion later in the chapter from Smith about how, when you have a labor dispute and workers are perhaps on strike or doing another kind of job action, if you're an employer, you can often hold out for some times on stores of wares you produced previously. This is before the era of just-in-time inventories, and hold out, having your management staff do the production. They always try that to this day when there's a strike, that's always fun for injury rates going up. But his point was like workers, how long can they hold out in a strike? I mean, it's before modern strike funds, but I mean, it's still like it's human beings that have daily needs and kids that you have to feed every damn day. So I'm told, So so just as a little example there, like Adam Smith and other of these guys like Ricardo, and certainly including Marx, who's among this era of classical economists, like they were aware of power relationships and how they shape the outcome of markets, and certainly the prices that are arrived at in the marketplace. Another thing which Hayek's perfect, miraculous information machine picture of markets fails to leave out. So I feel like their relationships there are kind of rocky, and if you kind of talk to these economists at all, they're very reliant on people knowing the message of the Wealth of Nations is that markets, capitalism is very good and you don't want government. Like, that is not anything like the content of these texts. So I think so much of this skates by on the fact that conservative intellectuals, it tends to be very surface, and you can get away with that. And you have media that you go on where no one's going to force you to talk with anyone who disagrees. I mean, today's liberals are economically as conservative as the Republicans were 50 years ago. So there's very limited chance you'll have to actually confront someone who can quote the embarrassing parts of Adam Smith to you. So I don't know. I don't want to overdraw the point, but I feel like the shallowness is like a huge part of this.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm so happy to hear you point that out, because I mean, Adam Smith, I don't think he was completely without concern for like man's need to eat every day, his material needs. And like when he wrote about markets, I believe that he wrote about with markets with the concern for man's material needs, but that sort of washing away of that in favor of a sort of like the laissez-faire sort of ideology. I feel like maybe Hayek had a hand in sort of erasing some of those concerns of Adam Smith. Because you don't hear, if anything, it's a concern for the health of markets over the prosperity of people. But yeah, you mentioned Ben Burgess and you mentioned Matt McManus, man. I love Matt, dude. Like, I'd listen to that guy talk forever. And I read his book, The Rise of Postmodern Conservatism, and it's just incredible stuff that really educated me on like sort of the legacy of reactionaries through history. And we have an episode on with Matt McManus as well, covering that stuff. I really recommend and suggest that to listeners go check out if you're interested. But yeah, so I think that, it's funny, man, like when I research this stuff and I realize that like there is that washing away of like the concerns for the material needs of man in favor of like the primacy of markets. And I've given a lot of thought to that stuff, but sort of a new thought that occurred to me was that, Hayek kind of makes people like Keynes seem a bit more like moderate, man. Because like even Keynes was in favor of like some kind of regulation, government intervention at times, whereas Hayek was straight up laissez-faire and trying to convince you that it was like going to lead to tyranny if you even tried to interfere. So I wonder if like, are there, I mean, just as a brief aside, like, are there more extreme right-wing economists other than like Hayek? Like, is there someone that's like more laissez-faire than this guy, or is this guy just laying the smackdown as like he is the advocator of laissez-faire, non-interventionalist, sort of market mythologizing sort of thing? Like, is there a Hayek that's even more extreme than Hayek at all, or are we just dealing with like, is this as far as it goes?
Oh, sure. There's always someone more right wing. I mean, that's,
Well,
sure.
I mean, like not like so it's like on this show we've covered. It's funny, you mentioned before we read a lot of right wing stuff. I went for a spell. I was reading some like Julius Evola, and of course he's like way more right wing, but he's not like an economist. So I was wondering in terms of like the right wing economists, is there like a Hayek 2.0 kind of thing?
I think if I was going to think of something like that, I would probably go toward Murray Rothbard, great U.S. Full libertarian economist. Incredibly long tomes that guy's written. Just like abominable views. Certainly more minarchist, super minimal government than Hayek. Hayek, again, I mean, hell, like a lot of U.S. economists today are more conservative than Hayek. Again, he was a European, so he was willing to countenance a little bit of welfare state, just at least when he was writing, because of just how overwhelmingly popular its mandate was. And I guarantee you he was just as disgusted by it as his American colleagues were. But, at a certain point when you've lost a debate, you kind of just need to accept it so you can fight on the remaining subjects. You have to say like, all right, well, They freed the slaves, but I still shouldn't pay taxes on my huge farms, even though I no longer have full-on slaves. I still shouldn't. Like, eventually, you have to give it up. And so I think Hayek is sort of like that, and he and Friedman too, because Friedman, I mean, he wasn't he technically never had full government titles, Milton Friedman, but he advised Reagan and Thatcher and Pinochet and all these characters. So, there seem to be sort of sellouts because, like when they write, they're like, we should privatize Social Security like Friedman was. And then he's in government. He tells Reagan, like, well, let's cut taxes on the rich and we'll see if we can do Social Security in the 2020s. And it turns out we still can't. But social democracy is popular. It's conservatives lament the one way ratchet. Like once you get social democracy, even a little crumb of it in the door, it's very hard to take it away from people because they fucking want things to be freed from the market. Since we're so wealthy and can easily afford that, they feel like they should have a positive liberty to consume it. People are crazy like that. But there's always like more right-wing figures. And certainly these days, I mean, lots of tiny idiots with no following are competing to have, more abominable views on child labor and getting rid of, age of consent laws and so on. Just to pick two that seem to be very important to them. So like that is definitely the case. But Murray Rothbard, I mean, again, it's been a minute since, I read a book of his or two of his for this book too. I tried to read like all your big foundational libertarian books that people are so proud of. But I mean, like Capitalism versus Freedom and Hayek's work, I mean, when you read these things, they're mostly just lists of right-wing demands. Like there's never like a basis. Like they sort of like, here's the logic of it. That's good. Look how this guy's rich. So it works. Like it's just incredibly lazy. I don't know. Like I was, again, when I was young, I was given Capitalism and Freedom, and told like, you read this and this will shut you up, you dirty communist. Because I was complaining that the GE factory in my Midwestern town was shutting down and laying off everyone to move production overseas. So they gave me that book. If you read it, it has like 12 footnotes total, like in the book. And half of them are footnotes to Friedman's own columns for Newsweek. Because, liberal media will always run the crazy friggin' right wing. That's always been the case. Right. Amazing how much the right complains about liberal media never being heard. Like you can't get away from their dumb arguments. It's amazing how much that's
you really can't, dude. Like
really cannot.
I will tell you, and this might be a little afield, but I will tell you that like I went. I've been picking up photography recently, and I've been looking at what photographers do in their work. And I came across a guy recently who specifically takes photos of the rich. Fun. And right. So like there's elbow patches and like skeet shooting. I don't know, they're shooting like birds out with like these elephant guns and stuff. There's golf courses, there's beaches with everyone wearing chic all white stuff. There's like huge looking like looking like you're living in a castle / mansion with like that, like you're the fucking Queen of England with your lawn tapered that way, and I just like, and part of me thinks that maybe these fucking arguments work because these people have power. And so like the need for a sort of consistent, robust, logical sort of thing to like to back up their arguments. It's not really necessary when you have actual power. And
it's true. Yeah. I mean, that is the case. And the thing I conclude in my book is if you look at it, I mean, these guys are just stenographers of power, like, these guys are there, they're apologists for power and power institutions. I mean, these are the same people who talked about how great Stalin's system was and how great, this new Mussolini government is, and really things are going like these are those people. Like we need the trains to run on time for industry. They'll bet any goddamn social regime and regimentation or ethnic cleansing if it came to that. I mean, because it has come to that like numerous times. Like they'll bet anything and then talk about how it's great. Like, oh well, this was bad. Like the Friedman's, Milton writing with his wife Rose, as he often did in Free to Choose, his other big book. I remember there's a passage I quoted in mine where he says, oh yes, 1800s America, all these immigrants came, and yes, they mostly got fleeced and crushed by Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan, and ended up getting crushed in a mine or dying poor during an economic crash in the Midwest on a farm someplace. But they came in with their eyes open, and they all had their chance, and they came in the door excited, so it's okay. Like they just rationalize it, and it's just a few sentences go by, and Rockefeller using train rate control to get a monopoly and crush everyone. It's all just exonerated. It's cleansing like the forgiveness of our Lord, the claims of these right-wing intellectuals, but they're just abominable. I mean, there's no like reason to. Again, I'd write books about these people's work, I don't respect them. Like, there's no reason to. It's
Right.
people shouldn't do that.
Well,
So I don't know. Yeah, although I do want to hear the name of this rich photographer. This photographer to the wealthy. I gotta get that for the book, please.
I'll get that offline for you.
I gotta get that link. I think, please.
He's not actually poor, quote unquote, but the guy.
That's good too, because also I want the next book to have pictures in it. No one puts pictures in their nonfiction books. It's too childish, I guess. Like, it makes books better to see the faces of the idiots you're talking about and stuff. I think it does.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Like, I've been to I went to a gala once where people were like, things were being auctioned, and it's always like horse shit. It's like, here's a football helmet that's signed, and somebody holds up a sign for 25 grand or something, and
high-end philanthropic auctions. That's like their favorite thing.
Yeah.
We're showing off how rich we are than each other, and showing that we care more for cause X,
Yeah, but also, like, apparently, like, debutante balls still exist.
Old money, despite it all, old money still exists, despite wave after wave of new money. It's capitalism, so you get that.
Yeah,
but they're real, man. It is incredible, isn't
it? Like it's fucking like for listeners that aren't familiar, because I fucking was not familiar with debutante ball stuff. Apparently, debutante balls were like the rich families all gather for like a gala, and they bring their like 18-year-old daughters, and they do this like stupid balancing dance to present themselves as if they are willing to marry into this class of society. And
say, look at my hot young daughter.
Yeah, part, and it's just like
which
fucking
is so, like, which it's good.
It's very like Eyes Wide Shut seeming to me. So anyway, so that stuff exists, and then I saw this photographer, and I just, man, like, part of this is just so, and that gala, I brought back memories from that gala where it was like, people are just casually holding up signs like 25 grand. I mean, that fucking football helmet.
Indeed. I have a personal acquaintance who married into real money. And I remember the patriarch of their family saying once, just telling some story at the end, he came out with 10 grand. He goes like, well, it's 10 grand. It's not life changing. I was like, that's exactly the minimum amount to change your life completely. If you have $10,000, you can move to a new town and start a new job and like put down a deposit on an apartment and have enough time to figure things out. 10 grand is exactly the life rebooting amount of money. I've never had anyone disagree with this, but if you're wealthy, you don't, rebooting your life, I should need at least $100,000,
Yeah.
People immediately do lose touch. And to answer your original question, like, it's true. I do feel like that certainly puts a floor under how hard it is going to be to make your argument if you're a conservative figure propping up power system X, whether it's our great President Trump or, Mussolini or capitalists or, the Pope, if it's that era of history where people care about that shit. If you're writing to prop up some power center, your writing only has to be that good. As long as you basically are repeating what they want to hear. And if you can make it fun or appealing or have a new style or a new convincing angle to it, like, that's how you prove your value to evil institutions and power mongering rich bastards like these. That's how they notice you and they'll lift you up. And soon you're working on Elon Musk's staff because you talked about how good his meme game is in that video that went viral yesterday. And next thing you know, you're doing this. But it also speaks to something else about these hierarchies too. And this connects to that 10 grand remark earlier. Mm-hmm. I always just tell my students this too, and this applies to not just the wealthy, but if you're like rich or famous or powerful, if you're any one of those three things, very quickly, you're going to be completely surrounded by people who do nothing but kiss your ass. And all the point of that is just people need to realize that very quickly you will lose touch with reality if that occurs. If everyone around you tells you you're great, why would you, you'll believe it. And then everything that goes wrong is someone else's fault and you're just God's gift to everything, like all these boobs think they are. That's the key thing. If you're famous or powerful or just wealthy, anyone who wants to talk to you, part of their goal is to get close to whatever of those things you are, and not only will you lose touch with the value of money and so on, but just you'll lose touch in general.
Well, I think there's also when I spoke with recently about some Friedrich Nietzsche, there was an aspect to his writing that is seductive, and I think part of the seduction that Nietzsche accomplishes is that he's inviting you into a sort of privileged esotericism, you have privileged information about this insider knowledge, and that makes you special. That makes you eligible for my project. That means that you can be an overman, right? And in a
That's
way,
great. You can be part of it. Like the
you can be part
invitation,
of it.
that's
Yeah.
enormous. That's a
Yeah.
great point, Jules.
So
Yeah, that's
I wonder, in terms
powerful.
of Hayek, man, in terms of, does he do something similar in terms of like, oh, well, you mere mortal, like markets are vast and unknowable and certainly cannot be, that like it's the knowledge of markets is dispersed across millions of people. And like the few that are chosen for a planned economy would not ever have the knowledge, but I wonder, does that contribute towards this sort of like overall, I guess what you termed, I'll take your term, like the market mysticism. Like how much does that contribute towards that?
Yeah, the invitation aspect's real interesting, and you've got me thinking back now because that's not something I really thought about on its own. And, I might need to like
No, no, yeah,
revisit some of these guys with that in mind, just because that's an interesting question because that's so appealing, and especially a country like the United States where we have weak as shit social bonds and everyone moves all the time and starts over with friends and lots of people are kind of lonely. Like something like that where you feel like you're part of a secret clique or club, that's like incredibly magnetic to people. So that's a great point, man. That's real interesting. I mean, you think of like the whole Mount Perelin era for them. It's about how like, well, okay, well, social democracy, and even in the U.S. they have the New Deal, Great Society. Like, we're kind of that's that's as close as the right ever gets to a wilderness period. Is that Cold War social democratic,
yeah,
labor consensus era. We're going to accept labor unions and Social Security. Oh my God, how are we going to squeeze every drop of labor power for no money out of these people if there's a social safety net and they have their own bargaining power? That's bullshit. Adam Smith's whole point was that even, that's little enough for them. They'll still probably lose. That was the point Smith was making.
yeah. Wow.
So if you look back at that era, like when they are on the back foot and they have like, mini millionaires, they're being taxed. They don't have like the wealth we're used to them having now or, previously when they did in the Gilded Age prior to that. And many of them have to keep their heads down. Their side's a lot less popular. They're the villains in popular media a lot of the time. Big rich people throwing their weight around. Like that appeals to American audiences to this day. So I think that like when they're in that period, that's when they're like, we're the rebels against the big government New Deal consensus. Like that would be the era when it's about like having like a quiet clique. And I don't know, I mean, right-wing media does do that real well. Like every Glenn Beck, Alex Jones. I mean, hell, Rush Limbaugh, like it's all about how you're entering this group of people who are a little bit smarter than everyone else. And you're the ones we're the only ones who really see through shit. And because we have an explanation and people who aren't used to hearing any explanation for anything get very impressed. I feel like, yeah, they've been brought into this kind of select group of people. So that's a good thing. I mean, that's a good part of it, I think. But the whole market mysticism is like, just so much bigger than that. But I think like Hayek's, like that's his big legacy out of, the constellation of right wing intellectuals of this period is like especially that great there's a very prominent paper from the 1950s that he wrote for the American Economic Review about markets as that price as that information mechanism through price. And because this is one of conservatives' most beloved ideas, Friedman famously put it as no one knows how to make a pencil because like the wood is grown here and cut here and the graphite's mined here and processed in this place and then the rubber for the eraser and the copper band and all this. And so because it's made in so many markets that no one person is in charge of, no one knows how to make a pencil or anything else because it's the magic with the marketplace because it's all disaggregated. But of course, it was just fatuous for 50 reasons. I mean, in reality, pencil manufacturing has been very concentrated in most developed markets for many years. A couple German companies make all the pencils of Europe. This is common shit. Like even in their like, there was like a cute little example. They never go to like oil refineries or data centers or, chemical plants or giant food processing centers because that's like, oh, there's only 6 of these and they're very powerful. Oh shit. Yeah. And they have now the price reflects their levels of bargaining power and agreements that they may make or may not make, or maybe they break alliances, or maybe they do agreements secretly. That was a big thing during the Gilded Age, was secretly getting your products shipped for less by twisting the arms of the corrupt ass railroads. So there's all this huge amount of behind the scenes shit that happens in all these like simple prices. And there's 50 other problems with the argument too. I mean, the biggest single one is that it's just commercial prices that the price system captures. It doesn't capture any externalities, as we call them, from driving species to extinction by growing industries, to melting the climate. I mean, all of those things don't have direct commercial costs, so they are not part of the price mechanism. So how is the price mechanism so efficient? It must be greater than man. It must be like older. It's like the laws of math. It's just older than humanity. In reality, why is it so good? Because it ignores all the difficult problems. How much do things cost? Well, figuring out your car's actual cost is impossible. There's the sticker price you pay and your car's contribution to climate change and specific features of climate change, like ice sheet collapse and the regrowth of the tundra forests. What about your car's contribution to increase asthma levels of children living in households and communities along your work commute? How the fuck are you ever going to put a price tag on this? It's impossible. So in our economic modeling generally, and certainly in this whole picture of the marketplace, we just remove those issues from the question. Right. Much simpler now. We decide that those are not really issues. My favorite thing, like Wall Street Journal editorials, they always call the abstraction called the ecosystem. That's a phrase that's used a lot. What is this abstraction? Markets are an abstraction. So all you do is jerk off to those. So that's the dumbest argument you could ever make, conservatives. But also, I mean, every time, I live in the West Coast, and every time we have so much smoke in the air because the climate's drying out here that we can't go outside, I go, oh, that's the ecosystem. That hazy shit outside that is like the forests of British Columbia 2 months ago. And now it's here making every animal and human sick for God knows how long. That's the ecosystem, you dumb bastards. Yeah. I'm having a lot of tea here. I get excited.
No, good. Yeah. So, Matt,
that's that information bit of it. I mean, that's kind of Hayek's legacy, but it's just like a big embarrassing legacy. I mean, the other bit of it I like to remind people is that if you're in the marketplace, you pay for information. The Bureau of, the national record keepers put out like market shares for industries and their incomes every several years. But if you want like up to date information, you pay for that shit. You pay for a Bloomberg terminal or for Hoover business information or for 50 other, market data monitoring firms that are, connected to market clearinghouses or something. So you can get data, but you pay for that shit. Out of touch guys. Like, so it's just an argument that just has 50 individually fatal weaknesses. It's one of those, but this is like, it's great legacy. And to this day, if you don't take it seriously, the conversations that I have with my colleague economists are exasperating because none of them, and every one of them is stunned silent with one of these points. Yeah. Like, how can you have such disrespect? And it's such an established field. And what about the identical arguments from figure X? It's a great field. It's a great field. Great field to write a book by yourself. That's what I've found.
So I produce a podcast called Working People, and we just did an episode about the 10-year death anniversary of Aaron Swartz. And you mentioned the sort of how living under capitalism, you pay for information. And, Aaron Swartz wrote this thing called was it Open Guerrilla Manifesto or something like that, where he talked about how we need to liberate information. And there was a line in there that reminds me of some of the photographs that I've seen and mentioned. It reminds me of some of the way the rich are extravagant, is that, he's talking to like professors and students that are enrolled in university, and he says, you get to dine at this banquet of information and the rest of us aren't let in, or something to that effect. I'm paraphrasing, right? But yeah, like information is something that is behind, not just like increasing behind a paywall in terms of like articles that are relevant to your everyday life and news of what's happening in the world you live in. But it's also something like, if you really want to learn about cutting edge research about something that you want to know about and have a genuine interest in, you may have to pay some money to JSTOR or something like that to get that research.
Yeah, Swartz is a truly heroic figure for that, and just an unbelievable. My God, that story, is a thing unto itself, and I think it's fantastic that Working People considers cases like that part of their purview, because they very, legitimately are, and they have so much importance for, for all of us. My God, information wants to be free, but if I ever can control it, I will. And indeed, firms like, Google trying to, for brief periods, scan the entirety of the world's libraries. It's just trying to make everything a commercial asset that they're able to control. But that's just the thing, it's information, so it's relative to resources. Right now I'm just reading a Gilded Age history here for the book I'm working on here. And I came across this was just 20 minutes before I got on with you, man.
Yeah.
And it's the if you went to work for Rockefeller during the early days of his oil empire building, like the 1880s and 70s. It's Rockefeller's written pledge of secrecy. It's included here because years later it came out on the record, mostly during the antitrust trial of the company in the 1910s when everything goes into discovery. Creeps like me love it when shit goes to trial. That is, oh my God. When Bezos got divorced, I got so excited and they settled amicably. I was like, oh, damn. Good for his kids, bad for creep economists like myself. But back to Rockefeller, he says, this is the thing you would swear to. I will keep secret all transactions of the Southern Improvement Company. Preliminary conversations kept strictly quiet. And it says, I will not disclose the price for which I dispose of any products or any other facts that may bring to light the internal workings or organization of the company. And, to this day, if you go to work at Apple, you sign an NDA about the main NDA you sign next. Like there's an NDA that you can't disclose what you're going to see on the fucking NDA. Like that's
right.
If you're like a wealthy person, you go to parties that are celebrities or wealthy people. There's you write an NDA out. You read it before and sign it before you go into the party. It's a freaking commercial asset. So if you feel like markets like freely convey it, you're just indicating that you come from an economic position where you can pay for any information that's materially relevant to you. It's just another. My God, it's just such a flimsy. It's amazing to me the things that are taken as like major pillars of wisdom in my field. That's good stuff. People always say economics, the dismal science. That's like a thing that intellectuals say if they want to tease economists because, it's money and balances and accounting stuff. So it's dismal science. And I always say, well, you're half right. Not really a science. It's a dismal ideological area.
Yeah. So I guess just by way of rounding out, man, I thank you for your time and talking to me. It's been entertaining, more entertaining than I thought it would be. I've had a lot of fun having this conversation, just shitting on Hayek today. And so I feel like it's good for the soul in a lot of ways to shit on Hayek.
Feels good,
right on his chest. Anyway, so there's a book that just came out recently, and I don't know the name of the author. It's probably one of these really cool book publishing now, like Zero or Repeater or something. Something about like how techno-feudalism, like how capitalism is sort of leading us into this sort of neo-feudalism by way of technocrats, like with like a few select few like Bezos and Musk kind of having the bulk of the money and power and influence and realm of technology and stuff like that. And it's just turning us into like just something like similar to feudalism, which capitalism always had a seed of feudalism in it, just, but I wonder if there's like a deep sense of irony that you might pick out of this in terms of the road to serfdom, and we're having folks look at the long timeline and just call it like feudalism, but new, like the road to serfdom ultimately leads us to a sort of technocracy, feudalism sort of situation.
Yeah. So the question is, do I have a deep sense of irony about that? Yes, I do. I always feel that like today's, nonfiction writers, I always feel like no one's fun enough. No one's being funny and writing fun, cute books enough. That's a complaint I make a lot. We all need to be making more YouTube videos, especially kids don't read, listen to podcasts. They certainly don't read books. It's, you go on YouTube. That's where it happens. So we all need to get to work on that. But I feel good because as a writer, I have a catchphrase. I always say, irony loves company. Like it's an incredibly ironic global landscape today. I mean, for like 50 different reasons. But that's a big one. Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's the classic thing of feudalism, small estates where labor is bound to the estate and you can't leave. That's like the classic definition of feudalism as an economy. It's workers bound to estates and, giving service to a lord and so on up a hierarchy up to the king. Definitely feeling a sense of irony there. I mean, there's so much of that. I mean, just lately the FTC is cracking down on it, but like I always saw like the growth of non-competes, especially like in the working class, like people are like going to work at a Blimpies and they got to sign a non-compete. Like this is not like a hedge fund trader who knows the deal you're going to do when he defects to Goldman Sachs. This is like somebody who puts, different kinds of mayonnaise on giant sandwiches for American consumers. They don't have any trade secrets that are, worth taking away their freedom to.
Right.
the few freedoms that we have, to be a free agent in the marketplace. And just now the FTC is cracking down on those. But until government acted, that was just getting more and more common. That is a form of binding you to your employer, and obviously our visa system for so many workers right now. These poor bastards have to sit with Elon Musk and explain to him that he's not interesting to anyone anymore because we gradually get bored, even with twisted idiots who are huge messes and have public meltdowns like him. That's, they don't want to be there. I bet they'd be quite happy working for some more idealistic firm and for a less monomaniacal idiot, but they're bound to that employer. So I definitely would say there's a fair bit of that. Hell, Nick Hanauer said that he's scared of one of Bezos's former colleagues, that he fears peasants with pitchforks coming for the rich. That's another fairly feudal piece of imagery. And so technology has certainly been the king of that. Their whole thing is making it hard for you to leave, making it hard for you to move your data, hard to change phones, hard to control what they share with you. And as the public has gradually woken up to big tech over the last 3 or 4 years, people care more about that, and they're offering more options. And technically, you are able to see everything we know about you. But it is pretty amazing. It's very difficult. Companies from Google to Microsoft talk about how they build moats around their systems and make it hard for people to leave. It's harder than changing your bank, changing an online platform. And that's what my last book, BitTyrants, was all about, is just these firms specifically, because it's incredible over their 30-odd bull-year run. That sector, big tech and Silicon Valley, it's risen to become co-dominant with Wall Street itself in the economy, I would say.
Yeah.
No other sector of the economy, no matter how important, even like communications and media, were never able to, reach that level of supreme influence and, semi-control over all the other sectors of capitalism. So watching that new, itself very feudal in its grip on our asses sector rise up, I think, is a major source of the ironic feelings that I spend a lot of time discussing with my mental health professional. So yes, that's do I feel a lot of irony? Yes, I do.
Right on. Well, Rob Larson is professor of economics. He's the author of several books. We will leave links to those in the show notes. Rob, thank you so much for hanging out today. I had a great time, and we'll have to have you back on the show at some point to talk about other bullshit ideas from right-wing philosophers and economists that have 50 sort of fatal weaknesses in them, as you said. That's a great way to describe them. That, and they're all fucking terrible writers. So
really bad. The right is sort of discovering how to write jokes in a very mechanical, monkey with the keyboard way, and I fear that, because them never being funny has been a major advantage for us. But I'm afraid that you could just, none of the ones who they think are funny, but I feel like they're beginning to see. I fear they're gaining the intelligence to see that. So time will tell, man. But yeah, thanks very much, dude. A ton of fun.
Yeah, man. All right, we will see you next time.